The introduction and beginning of the search. For as long as I can remember, I have been a pastor. My father taught me to take care of sheep, to recognize their needs, and to understand each of their behaviors. At first, my days were reduced to long hours walking in the sun, searching for green pastures and fresh water for the flock. My hands became hardened from so much work, and my feet learned to endure fatigue. But over time, those routines that previously seemed simple and necessary to me began to fill my heart with questions for which I could not find answers. Caring for sheep taught me many lessons about life, but as I guided and watched over them, I began to wonder if anyone was doing the same for me. What meaning did my life have? Was there a greater purpose I was missing? I often looked at the starry sky on waking nights, wondering if there was anyone up there listening to my thoughts. I was disturbed by the feeling that, despite being surrounded by my flock, I was alone. It was in those moments of loneliness when I began to perceive the presence of someone else. I couldn't say how it started. At first, it was just a thought, a whisper in my mind that said, "You are not alone. I am your shepherd." This idea stayed with me, like a refuge I returned to on difficult days. When I felt lost, I remembered that whisper, and without knowing exactly why, I felt a little stronger. The seasons passed, and I moved on, leading the sheep from pasture to pasture. There were days when the green pastures seemed to appear out of nowhere, just when the flock began to despair. I began to notice that, no matter how barren the road, there was always a place where my sheep could rest, drink water, and regain strength. And every time I found those places, my mind returned to the whisper, "I am your shepherd. You will lack nothing." That promise, which I barely understood, began to take root in my heart. For a long time I wondered if it could be true that God cared for me like I cared for my sheep. I could see how my sheep trusted me, how they followed me without hesitation. Even on the difficult roads, they knew that I would take them to a safe place. Could I trust in the same way? Could I really believe that there was a shepherd watching over me? Every day when I went out into the field, I began to feel that I was not alone. Like a shepherd providing for his flock, I believed that God provided for me in a way I had not seen before. When the sheep felt peaceful being with me, I wondered if that same peace could be for me. In those moments, I felt a small glimmer of something bigger, a hope that encouraged me to keep going. At first, I was afraid to believe. I didn't know if I could trust what I couldn't see. But my soul, exhausted by the search for answers, found relief in thinking that, perhaps, there was a purpose behind every step I took. I thought that since my sheep depend on me, I could depend on God. Without realizing it, I began to open my heart to this idea, to the possibility that, perhaps, God was really the shepherd I had always sought. And just like that, my life began to change. What was once routine became purpose, and what once seemed like loneliness became inexplicable company. I began to see the grasses and the waters as divine provision, as a reminder that, no matter what, God would take care of me. He was a shepherd who provided, who watched over me even in the darkest days, and within me, peace began to germinate, like a timid sprout longing for sunlight. Rest in God and inner strength. As the days went by, I began to notice how my own needs and those of my sheep were similar. Just as they looked for green pastures to rest and regain strength, I also longed for that rest. During our days, we found meadows of indescribable beauty, places where the sheep could lie down, eat quietly, and cool off next to the still waters. I watched how the flock calmed down, and that same rest began to enter my soul, like an invisible balm that I could not ignore. Those quiet moments became my refuge, a reminder that God was leading me, just as I was leading my sheep. He reminded me that He also gave me waters of rest, allowing me to feel His presence in the midst of routine. With each day, I began to understand that, despite my doubts, He sustained me. No matter what happened, I felt that I was not left alone and that I found, more and more, a purpose in my life as a pastor. However, not everything was always peace and serenity. One afternoon, As the sun began to set, I heard a howl in the distance. He knew what that meant. A group of wolves were prowling nearby. Danger surrounded me, and fear took hold of me. The flock also perceived it. The sheep moved restlessly, trembled and huddled together, waiting for me to do something. For a moment, I hesitated. He was just a shepherd, a man with little more than a staff in his hand. How could I protect so many lives? But then I remembered how God had been with me in moments of rest, giving me peace and strength when I needed it. I clung to that sense of divine companionship and, with renewed determination, stood in front of the sheep, raised my staff and screamed at the top of my lungs to scare away the wolves. Even in the midst of that danger, I felt a warmth in my chest, as if God gave me the courage to face the threat. The wolves came closer, but I didn't back away. With my heart racing and my mind calm, I faced them, and at some point they left, as if something stronger had driven them away. The sheep looked at me, and I saw trust in their eyes. I felt that God had protected me, giving me the strength I had never thought I would have. At that moment I understood that, just as I had defended my flock, God also defended me. He was my shepherd, the one who took care of me, the one who gave me encouragement in the midst of danger. That night, as the flock rested next to me, I looked up at the starry sky and thanked God. Despite the danger, He had felt an inexplicable peace. Like the resting waters I found for my sheep, that peace filled me, made me strong, and reminded me that, no matter what trials came, He would be by my side. I felt that I did not have to fear, because the same shepherd who gave me rest would also give me the strength to face any storm. Thus, my faith began to grow. I learned that God not only gives me rest, but guides me through difficult times. I began to see every conflict as an opportunity to experience its strength. His promise of comfort and protection became the foundation on which I would build my life. I knew that as long as I trusted Him, I could find rest in the midst of the storm and courage in the midst of fear. From now on, my days as a shepherd would not only be to guide and care for the sheep, they would also be a constant lesson in faith. I was reminded, day after day, that God guided me as I guided my sheep. In quiet moments, He gave me rest. In times of conflict, He gave me courage, and that certainty, like a flame in the darkness, illuminated every step I took, preparing me for the challenges to come. Facing danger and divine comfort, I knew dark days would come. Being a shepherd didn't just mean leading the flock and finding green pastures. It also meant facing danger. Sometimes those dangers were obvious, like the wolves that stalked my sheep, but other times, danger arose in unexpected and frightening ways, like a shadow that slipped over us without warning. It was one of those nights when I came face to face with fear. We had been walking all day, looking for a safe place to rest, when a sudden storm trapped us in a deep valley. The rain fell heavily, and the sound of thunder reverberated off the valley walls, amplifying and spreading terror among the sheep. The shadows that were cast with each lightning bolt seemed to lengthen, enveloping everything around us in a deep, almost tangible darkness. As we moved forward, I realized how little I could see. It was as if we were moving within a veil of shadow and fear. I was not only afraid for my sheep, but also for myself. My steps became unsteady, and the weight of responsibility pressed on my chest. For the first time, I felt like I was truly in the valley of the shadow of death. I couldn't see the end of that dark tunnel, and anxiety began to take over me. I felt like I was alone, that I didn't have the strength to face what was to come. But in that moment of despair, I remembered something. I will fear no evil, for you will be with me. The words echoed in my mind, and I began to understand what they meant. God was with me in that dark valley. I wasn't alone. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, letting that truth wash over me. I held on to the idea that even though I couldn't see, He could guide me. Although He did not know what the way was, He already knew it. With this renewed confidence, I held my staff firmly and moved forward. I walked slowly, feeling that each step was guided, even though my eyes only saw darkness. When the flock stopped, I would talk to them, reassuring them, and by doing so, I would feel comforted. It was as if, in the midst of that storm, God was whispering in my ear, telling me to continue, to not let fear paralyze me. Then, something incredible happened. A flash of lightning briefly illuminated the path, and I saw a small cave in the rock, large enough for the herd and I to take shelter from the storm. I led the sheep towards it and, one by one, they entered. I felt an indescribable peace as I watched them settle in, safe again. I knelt on the cave floor, covered in mud and exhausted, but grateful. God had brought me there, even in the valley of the shadow of death. In the silence that followed the storm, I understood something fundamental. God did not promise me a path without shadows, but He did promise me that I would never be alone. Like a shepherd, He would go with me through every obstacle, every storm, and every dark valley. I felt the weight of His presence next to me, His rod and His staff, giving me the encouragement and security I needed. When dawn broke, the storm had passed and a soft ray of light entered the cave, announcing a new day. I stood up and, with a smile, looked at the sheep, who were calm and ready to move on. I was ready too. I understood that the valley of the shadow of death was not a place to fear, but an opportunity to discover God's company and protection in a deeper way. From that moment on, every time he faced danger, he remembered that night in the cave. God had protected me. He had been my shepherd and my guide. I knew that no matter how dark the road was, He would always get me safely to the other side. I learned to walk boldly, trusting not in my own strength, but in His protection. And so, with every step I took, I felt certain that I would never walk alone, because He was with me. No matter how deep the shadow was, His light would always reach me. His rod and His staff would be my comfort and my guide, carrying me through any valley, showing me that God's love is stronger than any darkness. Provision in the presence of your enemies. After that night in the valley of shadow, I realized that my life would never be the same. I had felt God with me. He had protected me from dangers, and now I understood that He was my refuge. However, it wasn't just protection that He offered me. As I progressed, I began to notice that God also provided abundantly for me, even in the face of those who wanted to see me fall. A few days after the storm, I found myself in a territory we shared with other shepherds. We had had our differences, land disputes, and disagreements that had created enmities over the years. When they saw me arriving with my sheep, some of those men looked at me with contempt. I could feel their glances, whispers that seemed to judge every step I took. Still, I stood firm, remembering that God was with me. As I led my flock, I found a fresh green valley, a beautiful sight that I had not expected in the middle of that arid land. The other shepherds, my enemies, looked at me with a mixture of surprise and disbelief. I felt that this place was no coincidence. It was a gift from God, a reminder that He was preparing a table for me, even in the face of those who expected my failure. I watched my sheep eat and rest in peace. It was at that moment that I understood the true meaning of divine provision. Although my enemies expected me to fare poorly, God had brought me to this place, a place of rest and abundance. I sat in the meadow and gave silent thanks, watching God's blessings manifest, even among those who did not wish to see me prosper. Then, I remembered the anointing of the oil. In our town, anointing with oil was an act of honor, consecration, and protection. I imagined myself being anointed by God, being set apart and protected under His care. It didn't matter who was around me or what they were trying to do to me. I was marked by the oil of His love. God had chosen me, and that gave me unshakable security. My cup was overflowing, not only with water or food, but with a peace and gratitude that flooded my being. I realized that God's favor was not limited to protecting me from evil. He gave me abundance, even in the presence of those who opposed me. It was as if God was telling me, "Look what I have prepared for you. Fear not. My blessings are stronger than any ill wish others may have for you." While the other pastors looked at me, I smiled and silently thanked them. I knew that my blessings came not from my abilities or my effort, but from God. And I understood that this was incomprehensible to many. It was clear that God was taking me through a journey of faith, showing me that His favor does not depend on circumstances or the approval of others. It is a gift, an inheritance that cannot be earned, but simply accepted. God was preparing a table for me, and not just a table of physical provisions, but one of honor and love. I knew that wherever He took me, I would find what I needed. My enemies might be around, but that didn't matter, because God was with me. He anointed me with His protection and filled me with His abundance. At the end of the day, I looked at the sky and was grateful. My heart was full, my soul overflowed with peace, and my life was marked by His love. I felt safe, knowing that it didn't matter who was against me, because God was for me. I got up and looked at the sheep, who were already sleeping peacefully. The night was falling, but I knew that His light would accompany me, always guiding me to places of blessing. So, I moved forward, certain that no matter who opposed me, my God would always bless me. He provided for me abundantly, and in His presence, I found a joy and peace that nothing in this world could take away from me. I knew that my life was in His hands, and that His provision would follow me, even in the most unexpected times and places. Hope and security in the future. After everything I had experienced, a new conviction had settled in my heart. I knew that the same God who had guided me through green pastures and protected me in the valley of the shadow of death would still be with me, not only in the good times, but all the days of my life. As I reflected on my day, my heart was filled with deep gratitude. He had brought me this far. He had shown me His care at every step, and now I understood that His goodness and mercy would always follow me, no matter what path I had to travel. One day, while resting under the shade of an olive tree, I looked at the horizon and thought about the future. My life, like anyone's, was full of uncertainties. I had often wondered what destiny had in store for me, but now those questions were no longer tinged with fear or anxiety, because I had discovered something bigger than any circumstance: the presence of God at my side. I did not have to fear what was to come, because I knew that His goodness and mercy would be my constant companions. I had reached a point in my life where I could look forward with hope, not because He thought everything would be easy, but because He was convinced that He would never be alone. God was my shepherd, my guide, and my refuge. He understood that the peace he had found was not a temporary thing, but a lasting promise. He would walk with me to the end, and at the end of my days, I knew my home would be in His presence. Thinking about eternity used to seem abstract to me, but now it felt like something tangible and close. My time here would be temporary, but God's presence was something eternal. I knew that no matter what, His love would sustain me, and that I would always have a safe home, one that does not crumble over time, but grows stronger in His faithfulness. I felt a serene joy, a deep satisfaction knowing that my final destiny was in His hands. It was not just an earthly life of blessings and protection. It was about something bigger. God had shown me a love that went beyond any circumstance and had given me a place in His presence, a place that cannot be lost, even on the last day. I couldn't help but smile as I imagined it, being with Him forever, in my Father's house, surrounded by His light and His peace. I stood up and looked around, seeing the hills, the fields, and the blue sky. Everything seemed so small compared to the greatness of His love. My life here was just the beginning, a preparation for eternity with God. His goodness would follow me, His mercy would accompany me, and in the end, I knew I would always have a place in His home. And so, I moved forward, with new peace and renewed purpose. God had been faithful up to this point, and He knew He would continue to be faithful, always. Every day, every step, was wrapped in His grace. I walked with the certainty that, although the seasons changed and the days passed, His love and goodness were immutable. He had found rest in His presence, and now walked toward a secure future, knowing that, in Him, He was complete. With this certainty, I could face anything life threw my way. There was no room for fear, because my heart was full of His promise. And with each step, each breath, I moved a little closer to the day when I would finally enter His house, where I would dwell forever, surrounded by His peace.